Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining me. Now, last lesson we looked at evacuees and children being evacuated from the cities such as London and even Manchester into the countryside to avoid the danger of World War II, the bombing that was taking place in those cities. That was part of what was known as the home front, how World War II affected people at home, and so it was given the term the home front. I want to look at another aspect of the home front today, and I want to look at rationing and why was rationing introduced in World War II. Now, you might remember back at the beginning of 2020, when the COVID virus initially started, there was panic buying in supermarkets, and we saw supermarket shelves which were empty. People bought a lot of food. Quite often they bought more than they needed, and they stocked it away or hoarded it. And that meant there wasn't enough for other people. Some people had to go without because others had bought too much. And that ended up on the newspaper headlines. And there was a risk that there would be rationing. Some supermarkets restricted the amount of food you could buy. You could only buy 3 tins of a certain thing, or 3 items of another thing. Now that was known as rationing. So, what I want you to do, in your notes, the first thing I want you to write down is a definition for rationing. Rationing is allowing each person to only have a fixed amount of something. So you're limited in what you can buy. So we need to understand, why was rationing brought in for World War II? Well, first of all, food supplies were limited. A lot of food that was brought to Europe, and particularly Britain, came from America and came from overseas. Now, when it was arriving and being brought across the ocean on huge boats, the Germans would use submarines known as U-boats to attack these ships and sink them. So we weren't getting all the food we needed. Also, food was needed for the soldiers, particularly when they were fighting abroad. We needed to make sure they were fed. Petrol was in short supply as well. Just like food came from overseas, so did petrol, and that was often in short supply. So people couldn't have the same amount of petrol as they were used to. Cars weren't as common as they are now, but even so, if you were fortunate enough to own a car, you certainly wouldn't be able to get petrol as easy. Priority was for the war effort. This meant that all the material we had in the country, all the metal, all the things that we normally use to build the good things, were now being used to build things to fight the war with, to build aircraft, to build ammunition, to build weapons, even to provide for uniforms. Which meant that fabric was in short supply as well. Quite often you couldn't get the clothes you wanted to buy, because fabric was being used to make uniforms. And also, the material used for fabric, the cotton, that was coming from overseas. And just like it was difficult to get food, just like it was difficult to get petrol, it was difficult to get cotton and the material to make clothes. So this meant that people were limited in what they could have. I've put in front of you now a list of what food people could get in World War II. I'm not going to read through it all. What I'd like you to do is pause and read through it yourself. But just to give you a very quick idea, for bacon and ham you got 4 ounces. That's 113 grams. That is just 1 quarter pounder burger from McDonald's. That is the amount of meat you would get for the week. Nothing else. So, in front of you, you've got the allowance somebody would have for a week. Now, rationing was a means of ensuring a fair distribution of food and commodities when they were scarce. It began after the start of World War II with petrol, and later included other goods such as butter, sugar and bacon. But eventually most foods were covered by the rationing system, with the exception of fruit and vegetables. So I want you to think for a moment, why do you think fruit and vegetables were not rationed? What could you do to have your own supply of fruit and vegetables? That's an important reason to consider why they weren't rationed. Also, ration books were given to everyone in Britain, who then registered in a shop of their choice. When something was purchased, the shopkeeper marked the purchase off in the customer's book. Special exceptions were made, allowing for some groups of people who required additional food, like underground mine workers, members of the Women's Land Army, and members of the armed forces. If you were working in factories, if you were working on the railway, or if you were pregnant, you would be allowed additional food. Now, you still had to buy the food, you still had to give money, but also you had to give your ration book, so you couldn't buy too much food. You couldn't buy more than everybody else. It stopped the supermarket shelves being empty. Now what I've done is I've shown you some examples of ration books. And we've got a ration book for food, that's the brown one. In the middle I'm showing you a picture of a ration book which was used for petrol, and it's described as mortar spirits there, but that was fuel, petrol. And then finally a clothing ration book. And everybody had their own ration book, and you had to use that to buy the things you needed. Now, the Ministry of Food was a government department set up at the start of the war, all the way through to the end of rationing in 1954. Its aim was to regulate food production and usage. The Ministry of Food used numerous ways to help people make the most of their rations without wasting food, while at the same time giving them ideas to help make mealtimes more interesting. They introduced various campaigns and radio broadcasts, as well as literature, to help educate the public. Now I've shown you some examples of the posters that the Ministry of Food created. We can see one on the left saying use spades, not ships, grow your own food. Then we have dig for victory, and then we have a picture of a basket full of vegetables showing what you could grow. So what was the effect of this? How did this change Britain and the home front? Well, first of all, lots of land that hadn't been used for growing vegetables was used for that. Parks, playgrounds, and even here in the picture, a schoolyard, a school garden is being used to grow vegetables. We started seeing groups of people come together. Here we can see nurses in a hospital garden, and they're starting to grow their own vegetables as well. And people use their own gardens, starting to grow more and more vegetables, which meant that they didn't have to rely on the food from the shops just as much. So your assignment this week, I want you to create a poster promoting rationing. It should encourage people to grow their own food or make their own clothes. Now it should be eye-catching and it needs to be persuasive. So what's the marking criteria? What do you need to be doing to make a good poster? First of all, it's got to be factually accurate. You've got to think about the time when this poster would have been created. Make sure that detail's accurate. Make sure it's promoting rationing. That's the aim of this poster. And it needs to be eye-catching, so think about the images you're going to use and make sure it's in colour. And also it needs to be persuasive. How are you going to encourage somebody to do this? Now you can create the poster on a computer, you can draw it, I don't mind, but what I want you to do afterwards is upload it and send it back on Teams. So if you've got any questions, make sure you drop me a line and I'll answer them. Finally, take your own knowledge further. Don't just use this video. I've also given you a couple of other directions to look at. Go to the Imperial War Museum website. They've got some fantastic resources about rationing there, and also there's a YouTube video. Now for my class, I will send you a link to the YouTube video on Microsoft Teams. But if you've not got that, just go onto YouTube and type in World War II rationing, and you will find a great YouTube video which talks about rationing in the United Kingdom during World War II. So there we have it. That's this week's task. Look forward to seeing your posters. Get in touch if you've got any questions. Thanks very much. Bye bye.